Let's talk about engines. The XC90 does not have any known bad engines, but if the previous owner saved primarily on oil, then serious problems cannot be avoided. As for all engines, after driving over 200,000 kilometers, oil leaks appear on the oil seals, or, if the engine is not equipped with a timing belt, then from under the timing chain covers. The latter applies to gasoline engines of 3.2 and 4.4 liters. Total breakdowns of Volvo engines occur due to problems with the main radiator. Its honeycombs at the front are broken by stones, and the space between it and the air conditioner radiator becomes tightly clogged with dirt and dust. Radiators need to be kept clean, otherwise expensive problems will arise. 2.5T B5254T2 B5254T9 210 horsepower. The base 2.5-liter turbo engine is good and was available on this crossover in all model years. We have a detailed review of this engine where we talk about everything, including the diagnosis of the crankcase ventilation system. This is an important check. If you start operating the engine with a clogged crankcase ventilation, you cannot avoid problems with oil leaks through the camshaft and crankshaft seals. In addition to changing the oil every 10,000 kilometers, or more often, once every 100,000 kilometers, you will need to change the spark plugs. If you skimp on oil, then expect problems with the phase shifter clutches. Once every 100,000 to 150,000 kilometers, you will need to change the upper engine mount. Its silent blocks may look good, but if something under the hood rattles and hits when driving over bumps in the road, then these are questions for the upper mount. 2.9 T6 B6294T 272 horsepower. The Volvo XC90 with the T6 marking on the trunk lid is equipped with a 2.9-liter twin-turbo engine. Traditionally, it is considered that this is the most unsuccessful engine. In fact, all the problems with him started because of savings. Due to the tight engine compartment arrangement, oil leaks went unnoticed. Saving on oil led to wear on both turbines, etc. If the owner is attentive and does not save, then the 6-cylinder biturbo engine lasts a very long time. By the way, the T6 engine, the only gasoline engine for the XC90, is equipped with hydraulic compensators. 3.2 B6324S 238 horsepower. The naturally aspirated inline 6 appeared for the first restyling of the Volvo XC90, replacing the inline biturbo 6. In terms of power, the replacement turned out to be unequal. The temperament of this engine is very restrained. This engine has a combined timing drive. On the flywheel side, a double-row chain is thrown onto both camshafts. It is driven by a gearbox, which is connected to the crankshaft by a helical gear. The shaft of this gearbox drives the generator located under the intake manifold, and the pump belt on the other side, i.e. right above the automatic transmission. The 3.2-liter naturally aspirated engine needs to be listened to for the whistle of this gearbox. There are cases of wear of the bearings in it. After a mileage of 200,000 kilometers, the timing chain cover will have to be resealed. This engine also sometimes shows an appetite for oil. Overall, the 3.2-liter inline 6 is a good engine, but its maintenance work and spare parts are expensive. An interesting feature of this engine is that the intake valve lifters can switch between two valve lift heights. This system literally copies the system implemented on Subaru's Boxer 6's 4.4 V8 B8444S 315 horsepower. The icing on the XC90 Scandinavian cake is its naturally aspirated 4.4-liter engine. It was created by Yamaha engineers. Like all other units of the Volvo crossover, it is also installed transversely. Aluminum block, cast iron liners, 4 camshafts are driven by chains. A long chain is located at the rear and is connected to the exhaust camshafts, and the intake camshafts are driven from them by separate chains located at the front. Some super bells and whistles include phase shifters on all camshafts and a balancer shaft in camber. In terms of reliability, this engine even surpasses the Toyota US. It is simple and rational in Japanese. Just change the oil and consumables. On early V8s, a knocking sound from the balancer shaft has been noticed. And over time, the braid of the wiring laid under the hood dries out. There are few non-original spare parts for this engine. For example, only a branded timing chain is offered for $210. Thorough maintenance of this engine must be carried out with the removal of the motor. D5 D5244T 163 horsepower, D5 D5244T4 185 horsepower, D3 2.4D D5244T5 163 horsepower, D5 D5244T18 200 horsepower. The first generation Volvo XC90 was always produced with a 5-cylinder turbo diesel of its own production. This engine has a light alloy cylinder block and a timing belt drive. In fact, there are no problems with this engine. Although haters of aluminum diesel engines think otherwise, they do not provide any arguments. On the XC90, this engine is always equipped with a single Garrett turbocharger. Its very first version has a power of 163 horsepower. The geometry changing mechanism has a vacuum drive. Over time, due to vacuum leaks, geometry control is disrupted, which manifests itself in emergency mode. An error appears for incorrect boost and engine thrust disappears in the entire range or partially. It is necessary to check the vacuum tubes and the turbine control valve. It is imperative to pay attention to the front and rear engine mounts, which are attached to the subframe. These mounts are controlled by vacuum, so a crack in them or a malfunction of the valve that controls the supply of vacuum specifically to the engine mounts also affects the control of the turbine geometry. You should also not forget about leaks in the intake manifold, burst pipes or a cracked intercooler. Later versions of this diesel engine switched to a turbocharger with electromechanical drive geometry. The dependence of boost on vacuum has disappeared. But it was these modifications of the Swedish D5 diesel engine that had swirl flaps. They are laid directly into the cylinder head along the intake camshaft. Their common axis is driven by a servo drive. It and the thrust can be seen in the front of the engine, right under the oil filler neck. These engines also have a plastic valve cover, not aluminum. The drive is troublesome, the thrust drops, the flaps close half of the intake ports. Plus, over time, oil begins to leak from under the valve axis. Once every 100,000 to 150,000 kilometers, this entire mechanism needs to be given attention. To get to the valves, you need to disconnect the tubes to the injectors and lift the valve cover, which is combined with the intake manifold. Original damper assemblies today cost $320. There are several substitutes. Original pull less than $30. For such repairs, you need to change the valve cover gasket. It is advisable to change the fuel lines of the injectors as well. After reinstallation, they may leak. A set of pipes for injectors today will cost $740. Terribly expensive, but it was cheaper before. Otherwise, the Swedish 5-cylinder aluminum diesel is a real millionaire. Just don't skip your timing belt replacement intervals and keep your radiator clean and in good condition. Don't skimp on oil, because oil deposits accumulate in hydraulic lifters. The motor will champ loudly with them. M66/6-street manual transmission. Volvo XC90 with 5-cylinder engines was produced with 6-speed manual transmission M66 manufactured by Getrag. Volvo shared this transmission with Ford. The transmission is reliable and usually does not cause problems. Only at high mileage can a leak occur along the input shaft oil seal. There are also known cases of a hum occurring in 5th and 6th gears due to wear on their gears. Perhaps it is worth updating the oil in this mechanics. The Volvo XC90 was equipped with 3 automatic transmissions. 4T65E, 4-speed automatic transmission. The oldest automatic transmission went to the version with the 2.9 T6 engine. This is a 4T65E transmission from General Motors. Its history began back in the 1980s, with a major update in the early 1990s. In essence, this is a strong archaic automatic, but it withstands the temperament of the Swedish Bitterbo with difficulty. If the owner forgot about changing the oil, which should be annual, then after a run of 200,000 kilometers this transmission will eat its own bearings. Overhauling an American automatic transmission is always unpleasantly expensive. AW5051, 5-street automatic transmission, with a 5-cylinder gasoline turbo engine and the first version of a diesel engine, i.e., its version without swirl flaps. An automatic transmission from Isen is installed. It has 5 gears. Traditionally, this transmission is considered not very successful because it was sent for repairs at mileages of up to 150,000 kilometers. However, over time, XC90 fans have learned to get along with it. It is enough to install a radiator to cool the ATF and partially change this ATF every 50,000 kilometers. With this approach, the 5-speed Isen serves more than 250,000 kilometers. TF80SC 6-street automatic transmission. 6-street automatic went to all D5 diesel engines with swirl flaps, as well as to the naturally aspirated inline 6 and the Japanese V8. This automatic transmission is the most successful and durable of all that is found on the first-generation XC90. But life will be much easier for her if the owner installs an ATF radiator and refreshes her once every 50,000 kilometers. The driveshaft is suspended directly above the exhaust pipe, so its front joint and suspension bearings suffer from the heat. At the front, the driveshaft is attached to the bevel gear with a CV joint. Due to constant heating, the lubricant dries out in it, hence all the problems. The first thing that appears is a clicking or loud knocking sound when you engage forward or reverse gear. Over time, as the CV joint wears out, play appears and increases. To extend the life of the CV joint, You need to remove it at least once every 80,000 kilometers along with the drive shaft and fill it with lubricant, change the gaskets and boot. The CV joint housing can be easily disassembled for cleaning and maintenance. An original new CV joint will cost $600. Substitutes exist, but their quality is questionable. Constant heating leads to premature wear of the outboard bearing. The rear universal joint can also wear out due to drying out of the lubricant. Neither the bearing nor the crosspiece are sold as originals, only assembled with the drive shaft. Good substitutes together will cost $400. In general, specialized workshops restore worn driveshaft components. Angular gearboxes often require repairs in specialized workshops. Its output shaft is connected to the flange through a sleeve with internal splines. With harsh and inadequate operation and lack of maintenance, the angular gearbox wears out and breaks off the splines of this sleeve. In the most severe cases, the splines inside the transfer case also break off. In both cases, the gearbox stops transmitting torque to the rear axle. It simply slips along the broken splines when the Haldex clutch locks its clutches. An original new bushing costs $400 today. The remaining components of the bevel gearbox are not sold separately, so its restoration must be ordered from specialists specializing in these Volvo transmission parts. A Haldex coupling is installed between the drive shaft and the rear gearbox. It needs to change the filter with a cover at least once every 60,000 kilometers. The original will cost $60, and the oil. A liter of original oil costs about $80. This volume is enough for 2 changes. Ideally, to change the oil in the Haldex coupling, you need to remove the drive shaft in order to be able to remove the coupling pump and thoroughly rinse the housing from any remaining old oil. Along with this procedure, it is worth changing the oil in both gearboxes, servicing the universal joint and the spider. Separately, we note that 10 years ago, car thieves removed the control unit from the Haldex coupling. It is attached with only 2 screws, which can be unscrewed by climbing under the bottom of the car. This crossover has enough ground clearance. If lockers are installed instead of standard bolts, or if the edges of the bolts are machined for an internal hexagon, then this indicates anti-theft measures taken by the previous owners. Let us add that over time the seal of the cover of the Haldex clutch control unit disappears, and the contacts in the electrical connector also corrode. It would not be superfluous to remove the block, open it, evaluate the tightness of the lid, and additionally protect the electronic microcircuit of the block with a special varnish or composition. The electric motor of the Haldex pump may fail after a mileage of more than 200,000 kilometers, but today it is well repaired. Sometimes, with long mileage or as a result of hard use, the rear gearbox begins to hum. It's the input shaft bearing whining. There are no original spare parts for it. Repair is possible subject to specialized service. Front and rear axle shafts on the Volvo XC90 last at least 200,000 kilometers. Quite rarely they are changed at lower mileage. The original front axle shafts are sold only assembled. Worn CV joints can only be replaced with non-original ones, but practice shows that replacements last about 50,000 kilometers. In general, it is worth servicing your original CV joints, filling them with lubricant. It will be much cheaper this way. The steering rack also lasts for at least 200,000 kilometers, and its repair to eliminate knocking is carried out in the standard way, by replacing the rack bushings. Don't forget to keep an eye on the tie rod boots to make sure no water gets inside. We spare no expense in replacing the power steering fluid. Both the pump and the rack will serve for a long time and without problems. If you ignore fogging of the power steering pump along the oil seal, then the end will come pretty soon. The leak can be eliminated by replacing the oil seal. The Volvo XC90 chassis is completely car-like. McPherson struts at the front. Levers and their silent blocks often last longer than shock absorbers, i.e. care for more than 150,000 kilometers. Lever silent blocks are sold separately. Original parts cost $50 to $60. The ball joint is bolted to the steering knuckle. It lasts for a very long time. The price of the original is $140. A few words about the steering knuckle. If you hit the front wheel hard on a curb, for example, then in addition to a damaged shock absorber strut and its support, you can find a bent connection between the knuckle and the strut. The front bearings are a single part with the hubs and usually require replacement after a mileage of up to 150,000 kilometers. The price of the original hub is $210. The support bearings of shock absorber struts serve on average the same 150,000 kilometers. When wear occurs, a chumping sound usually appears, and then a rumble, because the rubber bearing race peels off from the metal race. A crack appears in the rubber damper, along which the support is literally torn to pieces. This crack can be seen from above from under the hood. But the bearings themselves rarely reach the point of crunching. The original support will cost $130, less than 100,000 kilometers in the front suspension. The front stabilizer rods are being maintained. The original rods today are valued at $100. Front and rear stabilizer bushings are not sold separately, but no one buys the entire stabilizer torsion bar assembly. Choose not original bushings. The original front shock absorbers on the Volvo XC90 are always conventional and passive. It is not so rare that they fog up heavily during a run of 100,000 to 150,000 kilometers. When inspecting the Volvo XC90 engine compartment on a lift, you need to pay attention to the lower automatic transmission mount. This is a bracket with two silent blocks, present on all versions of the XC90 with any engine. For 5-cylinder engines, this bracket is the same. For all other units, its design is unique. Due to cracks in the small silent block of this support, also known as the reaction rod, engine vibrations become more noticeable and shocks may appear. The cost of the original gearbox support is about $120. The rear suspension of the Volvo XC90 is not simple. There are 4 levers for each wheel, plus integral intermediate levers. All original silent blocks are sold separately, which allows you to save on the purchase of assembled levers. Although the number of silent blocks still does not give reason to talk about economical maintenance of the rear suspension. Silent blocks are maintained for 200,000 kilometers before they need to be replaced. For high mileage, the silent blocks of the rear subframe will also have to be replaced. The most expensive part of the rear suspension, the optional Nivamat shock absorbers, which keep the ride height constant despite the load. New ones cost $900 a piece. Replacements from the supplier to the conveyor cost $700. Do Volvos rust? The experience of the XC90 crossover shows that this car is good in terms of corrosion resistance. However, the paint can swell in the recesses under the door handles. The bottom rusts much faster. When inspected on a lift, many extensive red spots will be found both on the side members and sills, and on the subframes and suspension arms. Mastic anti-corrosive will no longer help here. A bleak picture awaits behind plastic lockers, but these areas can be stripped down to metal and painted or covered with mastic without serious effort. Over time, problems with the windshield wiper trapeze occur on the Volvo XC90, mainly due to the fact that the hinges of its rods jam. This usually ends with one of the rods falling off and one of the wipers stopping swinging. The best thing to do is preventive maintenance, clean the hinges and put lubricant in them. There are drains under the plastic skirt at the bottom of the windshield called the frill. They should be cleaned of debris and leaves at least once a year, otherwise the water collected there will flood the gutter in which a thick wiring harness is laid. From here, water can spill into the cabin through the technological hole for wiring or through the hose for air intake to the fan. On the left, under the frill, there is the input of the wiring harness to the central electronic module. Periodic overflow of the gutter leads to water entering this module. First of all, the contacts in the electrical connector corrode, the pins on the side of the module break off, and adjacent contacts are short-circuited. In general, jokes with drainage end badly. The rear windshield wiper on the Volvo XC90 sooner or later stops working. Moisture gets into the gearbox housing, which leads to corrosion of the gearbox axle bushings, and then to breakage of the plastic wiper shaft during jamming. A new original rear wiper servo costs about $300. There are many substitutes on the market. Over time, the Volvo XC90's rear door lock handle begins to jam. If you press on it to engage the lock, it will not come back. The whole problem is that the axis spoke of the handle is rusting. No amount of lubricant will help, because the spoke literally swells from rust. But removing and disassembling the handle to replace its axle with a knitting needle of the appropriate size is not a difficult task. By the way, please note that the trunk door does not have a cylinder. The only lock with a cylinder is on the driver's door. We advise you to monitor the performance of the cylinder. It should turn normally and open the driver's door. After all, if it jams and the battery is discharged, then without the help of car opening experts you will not be able to get into the interior of a de-energized XC90. Over time, it is possible that the steering wheel position sensor, also known as the SRS contact, may break down. At the beginning of problems with this sensor, the stabilization system is turned off in the extreme position of the steering wheel. A new original sensor will cost $650. There are several substitutes, but the owners learned how to repair it, or rather, adapt it to wear it. There is a trimmer inside the sensor, i.e. variable resistor. So you can adjust and select its resistance so that an error does not appear in the extreme position of the steering wheel. True, after some time the linear sensor will still fail. Those just a temporary solution. If a DSTC system error appears when the steering wheel is turned at small angles, cleaning the optical sensors inside the steering wheel position sensor housing from dust will help. Increasingly, there are cases when the key does not turn in the ignition switch beyond the first position. This occurs due to the jamming of the lock in the ignition switch. lubricant in it dries out, and this problem arises. In general, there is no particular difficulty in literally disassembling the ignition switch and getting to the spring-loaded locking mechanism in it. Cleaning, a little fresh lubricant, and the problem will go away. Over time, the beautiful interior of the Volvo XC90 can literally throw off the center armrest. When opening or closing, its lid will break off due to a cracked fastener. It bursts lengthwise along 2 fastening screws. A broken armrest is usually replaced with a used one. Only in rare cases does it break so that its fastenings in the area of the screws can be repaired. All keys on the instrument panel are illuminated by tiny incandescent lamps. Naturally, over time they begin to burn out. Original light bulbs with a long service life cost $15, and there are about 10 of them in the radio and in the climate control unit together. You can change them yourself if you are ready to disassemble the housing of the corresponding control panel. The alarm siren also fails on the Volvo XC90. In addition to errors in this part, troubles may appear, such as the battery discharging overnight. The alarm stops working due to the fact that electrolyte leaks from the battery and burns the electronic board. If the board is not badly damaged, then you can get by replacing the batteries with new ones. They can be selected according to the parameters in a radio parts store. If the electronic board is seriously damaged, you will have to buy a new siren. At high mileage, the steering shaft cross may crunch, it will begin to bite in extreme positions. Moreover, along with this, a plastic squeak will appear from under the steering column. The crosspiece here is of completely standard sizes, so instead of the original, which costs about $100, you can buy a suitable substitute. In general, it is worth updating the lubrication of the standard crosspiece at least once every 200,000 kilometers. One day, a Volvo XC90 may unpleasantly surprise you with wet front mats. This occurs due to clogged hatch drain pipes. They are laid behind the trim of the front pillars. The casing can be easily removed, and then you can clean the tubes of debris inside them.